All right.
Okay. So let's see. I was born in Jacksonville, North Carolina. After my mom and my dad split up, we went to live with my grandparents in Accokeek, Maryland, which was this very interesting, like insular little rural pocket right outside of DC. My mom worked for the government. She worked for Department of Defense. My cousin Jessica was like my sister. She was very much a part of my life. She was diagnosed with neurofibromatosis when she was about 2 years old. The doctors there were convinced that she wouldn't live to be 5 years old. She went on to live to be 36, but her whole life was marked by this shadow of like, you could die anytime. My grandparents had such incredible fear and hypervigilance, and now I recognize that there was trauma and there was anticipatory grief of her loss, but they were so protective of her. And so whenever she and I were able to get out and away and get out from under their thumbs, we would just kind of go wild. She'd be like, okay, we're getting tattoos, we're going to Red Lobster, and if we have time, we're gonna go like parasailing. It was just,
Amazing.
fun to the extreme. Jessica had a huge impact on me. Her real sense of like the vivid tenderness of life really stuck with me always. Even though she was able to live to be 36, she still died with so many dreams unfulfilled, so much potential and promise that never got to be expressed. And that really stuck with me too. I felt a sense of commitment to her to live a fully expressed life in ways that she didn't get to.
What a beautiful gift to each other.
Yeah. In my family, I was around people when they died, so that was very normal for us. In fact, I would say that the women in my family have embodied wisdom around tending to people who are dying. So that really very much feels like a part of my lineage as a death doula, is that dying is a normal part of life, and when someone who we love dies, we're just going to rub their hands and their feet and make them as comfortable as possible, kind of nest around them, tell stories and laugh and sing songs to them and snuggle up in bed with them. So I have memories like that of being with my grandmother, with my cousin Jessica, and even other tangential people that weren't as much as close of our immediate family.
How young were you when you first experienced death and had the first moments of that wisdom imparted on you, maybe is the best way to put it?
My first death was around 4 years old. My great-grandma Hester, I remember seeing my grandfather cry for the first time. I have this very vivid memory of being at her funeral and this big storm and this huge gust of wind blowing through, and my grandmother saying, "Oh, that's Hester. She's here with us now." There was a sense that death was fearful, that death could come and take us without a lot of warning, but also that there was a sense of reverence and duty and love to the dying and to our ancestors, and a sense that the spirits of our loved ones stayed with us or came back to us.
Ooh, can you talk more about that? Because I'm thinking of like growing up with religion, coming back. Like, what are the feelings that comes out of that?
The way that I experience the spirit of my ancestors coming back to me is that, there's this sense that they're kind of always present to some degree, particularly in the first year after a person dies. But then the veil sort of gets thicker again. And then during certain times of the year and during certain times of our lives, they are sort of more magnetized towards us, or that veil becomes thin again.
Do you feel like that was something that was taught to you, or is that purely experience from what you have felt growing up and losing loved ones?
I don't think it was ever taught to me with that degree of specificity. Part of that is what I have gleaned from those early lessons, because some of those lessons, they were taught to me with a sense of almost like secrecy, like I can really sense the fear of this part of our lineage being expressed as Irish Catholics. Like there's this degree of separation and of generations of trauma and violence that separate our lineage from the more earth-based ways of being and ways of experiencing spirit. Like noticing my great-grandmother's spirit like in a big gust of wind and commenting on it, that was something that my grandmother wouldn't necessarily express to everyone at the dinner table. That was something that was said quietly and like out the side of her mouth. Really, I got so disconnected from any sort of relationship with spirituality or ancestors. I went to Catholic school, 1st through 8th grade. I almost got kicked out because when it was time for my confirmation, I was like, I'm kind of interested in Buddhism and other things.
How were you exposed to Buddhism and understanding that any of those things were options?
Yeah, so I found the book Siddhartha at the library. I read so much. I was obsessed with like Cleopatra and like the Salem witch trials, and so I would get kind of fixated on a certain topic and go to the library and check out every book that I could find. Siddhartha was one of those books, the Herman Hesse book, and I was like, this is righteous. Like this really just feels right in my body. And so I told this to my confirmation sponsor, and she called my mother. Because in Catholic school, we don't really ask a lot of questions. This is the doctrine, you know, take it by choice or take it by force, you know? When my mother died, I really opened up to, I was really opened to a whole new world. I started having experiences very early on that, to me, there was no other explanation except that my mother was with me. I don't think that I really recognized myself as a healer until I started working as a nurse, and I was like, oh wow, this just really feels right. But in all of my roles, I've been a caretaker in some capacity.
Well, that's a good word to use, because I think when I say healer, or maybe when others hear the word healer, they think immediately medicinal or something like that. But to me, and maybe this is projecting what I've always craved more in my life, but nurturing is a form of healing on so many different levels.
Yes.
You're tending to different levels of that person's needs, which allows them to heal. So maybe you're not directly healing them, but you're giving them the space to heal.
I am a person who orients towards healing, and so I can walk beside other people on their path towards healing, because I really do believe that we don't heal each other, that we essentially heal ourselves, and that other people can support us in that.
Perfect.
I was working, with patients who died very quickly, very unexpectedly, and in ways that left their family reeling amidst very aggressive interventions. When you sign up for these surgeries, you agree to receive all of these interventions to keep you alive because it is so invasive and so high risk that they want to be able to respond if one of the many risk factors starts to come into play. Let me take a pause there. It's so big and it's so much. And I'm able to wrap it all into a narrative really well. But being in my body while I'm expressing that narrative is like, when I notice that my energy is starting to speed up, I'm like, oh, I need to slow down a little bit. The speed of the hospital is not the speed of trust. Is not the speed of an embodied yes or no. It is not the speed of nervous system safety. If your heart were to stop beating, do you want us to do CPR? Do you want us to do very intense compressions on your chest in an effort to make your heart start beating again? Do you want us to intubate you if you were to stop breathing? To mechanically and forcibly oxygenate your body with a tube that goes down your throat into your lungs, connected to this machine. In what we just did right now, that is the slowest I've maybe ever experienced someone going over what advanced directives are.
I would say you described it in ways that it wasn't even described. It was like the terms are thrown out. Do you
Right.
agree to this? Sign. And you don't know what you're agreeing to or signing to. You just know you want to live.
That's right. So when we went into the hospital with my partner, the nurse said, do you want us to do these things? And he was like, what? And she was like, oh, it doesn't matter. It's not really a big deal. Just sign yes or no. And I'm like, wow. And I remember being that nurse. I've been that nurse so many times. And we didn't even talk about all the myriad of things that can happen besides you live or you die. Like there's this whole range of things in between that could happen. And then I switched to working in long-term care, thinking, oh, this will be much lower stress. And I was pretty miserable. And it's around this time that my mother, who was 61 years old, she had end-stage heart and end-stage lung disease. She went into the hospital with blood clots in her lungs, and I went to be with her. She and I had a very complicated relationship. I was legally emancipated from her when I was 15. And so throughout my adult life, there would sometimes a year would go by and we didn't speak at all. But when she and I did talk, particularly later on when she was sick, she had a lot of questions about what was happening to her body. She knew that she wasn't a very good candidate for organ replacements. She wanted to know what it's like to have CPR. And, do I want that? Is this a right choice for me? And how do I figure that out? She wanted to know what all the complications could be like. And she wanted to have that conversation with someone who had seen that firsthand and who also knew her intimately. So we talked about things like, if at some point you're not able to speak for yourself, what do your priorities for care look like? If at some point your memory goes, or you're not able to accurately perceive and interact with your environment, then what are your needs for dignity, for comfort, for quality of life? If you're not able to move your body, if you're not able to physically take care of yourself, then what does that look like for you? What does meaningful life look like for you? And so when she went into the hospital this last time, there was a certain point where she was barely able to breathe on her own, let alone speak. And so she asked me to make decisions for her, to speak for her. And in that moment, there was this really profound shift between us where she was at her most vulnerable and she trusted me fully in a way that neither of us had ever really experienced before. And I was there at the center of this really tender and intense moment, and against all odds, I had all of the tools and the wisdom and the capacity to show up for her really well and to help create this beautiful, safe, peaceful nest around her for her to really trust and allow what was happening. This could have gone bad in so many ways. I could enter this room and then walk out of it later full of regret, full of, more trauma. And instead what happened was, nothing short of a miracle. We had a really beautiful and peaceful end of life experience in an ICU room. I had had lots of experiences in the hospital where I was the nurse for someone who was on comfort care. And I always noticed this part of myself come forward in those times. But in this certain situation, this version of myself that comes forward is like so gentle and so strong at the same time, like very like protective outer layer and very like velvety, soft, tender inner layer comes through. And so, yeah, that part of me came through in caring for my mom. And so through my grieving process, I was putting all these pieces together. I heard about death doulas, end of life doulas, which I had never heard of them before. And I was like, oh, I felt like I had had this download of like the recipe of how to tend to people at the end of life from these early experiences in my childhood, from these imprint experiences in the hospital, and then these experiences that felt like the real blueprint. I felt like this all came together inside my body in a way that it was just like, oh, this is the medicine that I'm here to share with people. So the word doula, the etymology of the word doula, it means like woman's servant, essentially. And you might be familiar with a birth doula, someone who walks beside a mother-to-be, a pregnant person, and supports them as they develop their care plan, their birth plan, their postpartum plan, and really is just someone who's there along the way as these things change, as life starts to happen and unfold. And, who we are and everything we bring to that moment smacks up against, the circumstances of the moment. And so we're there to help you orient towards the best possible next steps for you. And it's really a lot of just being with and attuning. It's very different than being a nurse. As a nurse, we're taught to fix, to control, to intervene. And as a doula, my role is to let things happen and to help us learn how to orient towards the things that are happening. So it's really a lot more about allowing. As a nurse, we have this this creed, first do no harm, which I have tattooed here on my dominant arm. And I've realized since shifting from being a nurse to being a doula that it's pretty much impossible as a nurse to first do no harm, because we are kind of in a perpetual state of reaction, and each action just sets off chains of events that we can't necessarily predict. Yeah, as a doula, I really do get to first do no harm, because my first impulse is not to do anything in response to what's happening, but to really notice. So my role in that situation is to come in and talk to the person who's dying, to hear what their wishes are, and to kind of review what care they're receiving, what interventions we're doing with them, and then to integrate those and talk to the family and the caregivers together. So I recently had an experience that is a perfect example. This woman had been on hospice for 3 years, which is very unusual, but she was just having a very slow decline. And her caregivers, though very well-intentioned, were not very comfortable with, removing any sort of interventions that felt like they would hasten her death in some way. The woman who was dying was ready. She said, "Let me go. I don't want to live this way anymore. I'm done. I'm ready. Let it happen." And so I reviewed all of these interventions with the caregivers. She's telling me she doesn't want to eat or drink anymore. So we can stop doing these things unless she requests them. We're not going to preemptively do these things for her. We're treating her with antibiotics for a UTI. Unless she is painful or she's requesting more treatment, we don't have to do this. She's being repositioned every 2 hours because that's a protocol that we've determined decreases her risk of getting pressure sores on her body. Well, intact skin integrity is not an appropriate goal for someone who is actively dying. And what her body is actually trying to do is sleep. And this is the sacred work of a dying person's body. So every time we go in and reposition her on our schedule, we're disrupting that important work. And so with a little bit of teaching and understanding of what all of these interventions are really meant to do, we're able to shift our priorities to meet her where she's at and support her in doing the work that her body is trying to do. So in this case, this woman passed away within 48 hours. She passed away. She died. She died within 48 hours once we stopped waking her up every 2 hours.
Like, how do you work with family and stuff to make sure that that space is, is it almost like training sessions with family to be like, this is what we need to do to make sure that this space is created? Or how does that, I'm sure it's different with everybody, but how does that?
Yeah, I think that I think a lot about how we use language, and how, what we're saying, what we're not saying, and how inside this death avoidant culture, we use language to avoid our discomfort with that. And so when I'm working with a family, the family of someone who is dying, what I really want to do is I want to talk to that person who's dying, if they're able to speak, and find out what language they're comfortable with. Find out where they're at with what's happening, how they're relating to it, and really support their family in meeting them where they're at. That would be like my primary goal. And then if that person is not able to speak for themselves and the family is around them and they're really sort of in denial of what's happening, what I've found is that it's not my role to move people from where they're at to somewhere else. These things will just kind of resolve themselves if we really allow them to express. So if someone's afraid, I'm not here to, rid them of their fear, but to meet that fear.
How do you meet a fear?
Well, I think that it can help to just very literally say like, fear. I see you. I feel you. That's you. I know you fear. Let's talk about it. What's going on? What are we afraid of? And I think there's a similar thing that happens with grief. And this is like just, I don't know, my tangent here, but I think that a lot of things that we would name depression are actually experiences of grief that's really stuck. But I'm a big fan of like naming things in a way that helps to relieve us of trying to run away from them. So we're not going to try and, tackle everything at once or think we're going to have like this marathon processing experience and then we're going to just be rid of our fear. We're going to invite in resources that help us to feel energetically connected with what feels bigger and stronger and more powerful and older and wiser than our fear of death. And that, for me, is where a lot of this relationship with ancestors and land really comes into play. Because for me, connecting with the earth, connecting with this whole vibrant, diverse, abundant web of life reminds me that I am a part of something so much bigger than just me. Once we have that resource on board, we can just meet that fear of death, even just like a little teaspoon, even just take a little nibble of it and just be like, what's here when I really tap into my fear of death? Okay, let's do it. Mm-hmm. So then, as I start to reflect on that experience of that embodied knowing of fear, I start to notice what it feels like in my body. I notice just like a tightness in my chest, in my throat. I notice the sensation of speed in my body, like almost like I want to get up and run. Even just working with that energy of flight that's coming up in my body now, like I can get up and move my body. I can even put my feet on the ground and I can feel the earth against my feet and press back. I'm breathing. I'm not dying right now. I'm here right now. I'm able to respond to my environment. I'm able to look around my environment and see that there's no threat right here, right now. I'm safe. And that's what being with fear looks like for me.
You used the term feeling older. And you said feeling older, feeling wiser, and I was just like, nobody talks about feeling older.
Yeah.
It's usually considered negative.
Right.
And you just used it in this really it took adulting and made it nurturing.
Like eldership.
Yeah.
Like tapping into our embodied eldership is, so powerful.
Feeling older.
Mm.
See, language right there. It's just like shifted my whole day from those 2 words. The second I saw that you were talking about a podcast, I was like, shut up. So let's talk about, how did you decide to do one? What's that process feel like? And then, how soon do we get to hear it?
On Death Jam, you can expect to hear about somatic ways of meeting the fear of death. You can expect to hear about the medical industrial complex and, meeting that momentum of trauma that can live in the body from interacting with the body as like a medical problem to solve. You can expect to hear about caregiver burnout and how to have a regenerative practice of tending to each other. Yeah, those are some of the things that I'm really excited to talk about. There are kind of some questions that we encounter every time I host the Death Jam community conversation. What are the wounds and wisdom that your lineage carries around death? What are your early memories? What are the beliefs that your family holds? Eventually, by the end, after we've all heard each other's and we start to get this sense of openness and comfort and possibility, then I invite the question, hearing all of these different ways of relating to death, what might be possible? If we're not just thinking about it in our head, but maybe answer from our hearts or our guts, what do we think might be possible in terms of how we relate to death or what happens after death? So some of those questions will probably continue to pop up.
Thank you. This has been such a beautiful, not even conversation, teaching. And a beautiful sacred space that you let me be a part of. I'm really grateful. Thank you for sharing it with everybody who's going to watch this too. I'm feeling very much like this is all for me, but I know that others are going to feel the same feel as I'm feeling. So feeling older.
Yeah, in a good way.
In a good way.
Thank you, Annie. This has been really, really sweet.
Thank you.
I've really enjoyed this.
Me too.